My name is Emily Carter, and I am 29 years old. If you're here watching this right now, I want you to pause for a second and tell me in the comments where you are tuning in from, because stories like this, stories that twist your heart and shake your mind, they reach people everywhere, across borders and oceans. And as you listen, I want you to think about one thing. If you had to rate this story at the end, would you call it a 10 out of 10? Or would you struggle to find words strong enough to measure what I went through? So lean closer, subscribe if you want more stories like mine, because I'm about to take you into the day that changed my life forever, the day I stepped into a courtroom and the world seemed to freeze. You know how sometimes silence can be heavier than thunder? That's what it felt like, the silence that greeted me when those doors creaked open. The judge's eyes widened. My mother rolled hers with that old, practiced disdain that cut deeper than knives, and my father stared at the polished floor as if it held every answer he had failed to give me throughout my life. I could hear the soft shuffle of people shifting in their seats, the faint clearing of a throat, the whisper of fabric against the wooden benches, but above all, I could feel the way every eye was now locked on me. I wasn't supposed to be someone anyone noticed, not in my parents' eyes, not in society's eyes, not even in my own reflection at times. Yet there I was, and all of them, even the ones who had mocked me, dismissed me, broken me, were watching with a strange mix of shock, confusion, and something else they wouldn't dare admit. That day, I wasn't just Emily. I was the storm they had tried to cage. It's strange, growing up in a family where you are both visible and invisible at the same time. My mother loved to present the perfect picture, the immaculate home, the well-dressed children, the dinners where she smiled like a porcelain doll with flawless teeth. But behind closed doors, her eyes rolled at my dreams, at my questions, at my very existence. She had a way of belittling me without raising her voice, just the sharpness of a look, the dismissive turn of her head. My father, on the other hand, was quieter, less cruel on the surface, but his silence was like an accomplice to every dagger my mother threw. He never stood up for me, never shielded me, never said, "Emily, you matter." And so, growing up, I learned to find strength in the shadows, to build myself in secret, brick by brick, word by word, because they wouldn't let me build in the light. They never knew about the nights I studied by flashlight under my blanket when I was supposed to be asleep, or the mornings I left early to work jobs they would have called beneath us, but jobs that kept me fed when they cut off their help. They never knew, or perhaps they did, but they never cared to ask. Walking into that courtroom, I carried all of that with me. Years of rejection, years of silence, years of being told, in 1,000 subtle ways, that I was less. And yet, what they didn't realize was that the very weight they had forced on me became my steel. Every slammed door, every cold glance, every laugh at my expense had sharpened me into someone they could no longer predict, no longer dismiss. The judge, when he saw me, didn't just see another woman entering a courtroom. He saw the person who had pieced together something my own parents had never expected me to have, a voice that demanded to be heard. That's why he looked stunned. That's why the room silenced. It wasn't just about who I was on paper. It was about the energy, the defiance, the sheer presence that I carried with me when I stepped forward. As I stood there, I remembered the younger version of me, the one who used to imagine what it would feel like if just once people stopped talking long enough to listen. And in that moment, they did. But let me not rush ahead of myself. Because for you to understand why that silence was so heavy, why my mother's eyes rolled so hard, and why my father couldn't lift his gaze, you need to know where this story really begins. And I'll take you there step by step, piece by piece, until you see what I saw, felt what I felt, and walked the road that brought me here. But before I go further, let me ask you again, where are you watching this from? Because no matter if you're in New York or Nairobi, London or Lahore, my story carries lessons that stretch across every border. Stay with me, because the deeper we go, the more you'll realize that sometimes the people who try hardest to bury you end up planting the strongest roots for your rise. When I was a child, I often wondered why my family felt more like a prison than a home. My mother, Margaret, had a way of walking into a room and sucking all the air out of it. She was elegant, admired, and terrifying all at once. To outsiders, She was the epitome of grace, a woman who seemed to have mastered life itself. Her tailored dresses, her polished manners, her practiced laugh at dinner parties. But behind the closed doors of our house, she wore her disappointment in me like a second skin. Every time I tried to talk about the things that lit a fire in me, law, justice, the idea that truth could be spoken into rooms where power tried to silence it, she would roll her eyes, sip her wine, and mutter something about how I'd never have what it takes. My father, Richard, was a quieter storm. He didn't mock me with words, but with absence. His silences at the dinner table, his refusal to meet my gaze when I asked him questions, his endless sighs whenever my name was mentioned, spoke louder than anything he could have said. To the world, he was a respected businessman. To me, he was a ghost in a suit who never once stood between me and the arrows my mother aimed at my spirit. It was in that environment that I learned the power of invisibility. At first, it broke me. I cried into my pillow, wondered why I wasn't enough, wondered if perhaps I was the problem. But later, I realized something. Being invisible gave me space to grow in ways they didn't notice. While they were busy flaunting their perfect image to the world, I was in libraries, devouring every book I could find about law, justice, and human rights. I watched documentaries late into the night, studied cases until my eyes burned, and when I finally earned a scholarship to study law, I didn't tell them. I let them think I was drifting, failing, lost in the wilderness they'd thrown me into. The truth was, I was building something they couldn't control, myself. I worked 3 jobs while studying, waitressing at night, tutoring during the day, and assisting at a local law office whenever I could. Every penny I made went into keeping myself afloat. Every hour I stayed awake past exhaustion was a brick in the foundation of the woman I was becoming. My parents only found out when my name appeared in a local paper. I had won a regional moot court competition, and the headline called me a rising star. I still remember my mother's face when she read it, the faint curl of her lip, the way her eyes rolled as if to say, "Well, it won't last." My father didn't even acknowledge it. He just kept reading the financial section of the paper like my existence was a minor inconvenience on the page. They dismissed it as a phase, the way they dismissed everything that didn't fit their mold. But their dismissal didn't matter anymore, because I was beginning to realize that their approval wasn't the currency of my worth. The real currency was the sweat on my brow, the sleepless nights, the victories I carved out of the stone walls they had tried to trap me behind. And so when I walked into that courtroom years later, at 29, the silence wasn't just about shock. It was about recognition. They were seeing, perhaps for the first time, the fruits of everything they tried to strangle. My mother rolled her eyes not because she didn't care, but because she cared too much and hated that the image she had built of me was collapsing in front of people she wanted to impress. My father looked down not because he didn't see me, but because for the first time, he couldn't avoid what I had become. And the judge, oh, the judge. He wasn't just stunned because I had walked in. He was stunned because he knew my name. He had read my cases, seen the way I fought for people who had no one to fight for them. And in his eyes, I wasn't just Emily Carter, the overlooked daughter. I was Attorney Carter, the woman who had built herself from nothing, the woman who had made her way into rooms she was never meant to enter. The weight of that moment wasn't lost on me. Every whisper, every glance, every breath that seemed to hang in the air reminded me of all the nights I had prayed for a day like this. Not for revenge, not even for vindication, but for truth, for a chance to prove, even if only to myself, that I had been right to keep fighting. And though I stood there alone, without anyone at my side, I didn't feel small. I felt like the room itself was finally acknowledging the storm I had always carried within me. And if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been told you weren't enough, you know exactly what that silence feels like. It's not empty. It's full of every word they can't say out loud. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not just in temperature but in atmosphere, as if the very walls had absorbed the echoes of every argument, every broken plea, every shattered dream that had unfolded there. I remember my heels clicking against a polished floor, each step sounding louder than it should have, pulling every eye toward me whether I wanted the attention or not. But I didn't flinch. I had spent years preparing for this. Every insult, every moment of dismissal from my parents, every late-night study session when my body screamed for rest, all of it had built me into a woman who could walk into a room like this and hold her ground. Yet as I stood there, taking my place at the front, the silence pressed harder. My mother's theatrical sigh, her eyes rolling dramatically as if she were embarrassed to even claim me as her daughter, cut through the tension like a knife. My father's gaze dropped to the floor, heavy and shameful, as though he couldn't bear to be confronted by the reality of who I had become. But the judge, he didn't look away. His eyes locked onto mine, sharp and assessing, and I knew in that instant that he remembered me, not as the daughter of Margaret and Richard Carter, but as Emily Carter, the attorney who had shaken up cases no one else dared to touch. I had been called to represent someone that day, someone whose voice had been drowned out by the system the way mine once was at home. It wasn't a glamorous case, not the kind that made headlines or won easy applause, but it was the kind of case that defined me. My client was a young single mother accused of theft, desperate, cornered, and painted as a criminal by people who never once bothered to ask what led her to that moment. I had met her weeks earlier, her hands trembling as she told me she stole baby formula because her child hadn't eaten in 2 days. And in her story, I saw shades of my own life. The hunger, not of the body but of the spirit, the way neglect eats at you until you think you don't deserve better. I promised her then that I would fight, not because I had all the answers, but because I understood what it meant to be invisible, to be judged without ever being known. That promise carried me into the courtroom, and though the silence of that room could have swallowed me whole, I let it wrap around me instead, a cloak I wore proudly because I knew I was there for something bigger than my parents' scorn. The prosecutor smirked when he saw me, as though my presence was a mere inconvenience to his well-oiled machine. He had no idea who I was, no idea of the fire I carried inside me. I let him smirk. I let him assume. People had been underestimating me my entire life, and every single time, I had used their underestimation as fuel. My voice, when I finally spoke, was steady and calm, but it cut through the silence like thunder. "Your Honor," I began, and in that moment, I swear even the walls leaned in to listen. I didn't speak like a lawyer trying to impress. I spoke like a woman who had lived the consequences of injustice, who understood the weight of silence, and who wasn't afraid to demand that truth be heard. I laid out my case piece by piece, not just with legal arguments but with humanity, weaving in the threads of empathy that too often get lost in the sterile language of the law. The judge listened, and though his face remained unreadable, I saw the flicker of something in his eyes, a recognition, maybe even respect. My mother shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. Her eyes rolled again, but this time I caught the faint twitch of her lips, as if she was fighting to keep her mask intact. My father still refused to look at me, his chin tucked low, hands folded tightly in his lap. But even their silence, even their attempts to dismiss me, couldn't touch me anymore, because the room itself had shifted. The jurors leaned in, the spectators whispered, and the judge, who had seen countless lawyers come and go, seemed to be measuring me against something more than just the law. For the first time in my life, I wasn't begging for my parents' approval. I wasn't fighting to be seen. I was seen. I was heard. And I knew that this was only the beginning. The silence that had once been suffocating now felt like power, and I wielded it with every word, every pause, every look that passed between myself and the people who were finally, truly listening. And if you've ever been in a room where your voice, after years of being ignored, finally takes up space, then you know what it feels like to stand taller than you ever thought you could. That day, I wasn't just fighting for my client. I was fighting for the girl I used to be, the one who sat in her bedroom, tears soaking her pillow, wondering if she'd ever matter. And though my parents might never say the words, I had already won. The air in the courtroom thickened as I continued. Every argument I made carefully sharpened not just by law books, but by lived experience. I paced slowly, deliberately, across the courtroom floor, not with arrogance, but with the steady rhythm of someone who had been told all her life to stay small and had finally refused. Each step echoed like a declaration. I am here. I belong. and I will not be silenced. The prosecutor's smirk faded the longer I spoke, his arrogance melting into agitation, his pen tapping against the desk as though he was scrambling to keep up. For once, the balance of power tilted, not toward the man in the press suit with decades of connections, but toward the woman whose parents still wouldn't meet her eyes. My client sat behind me, her face a blend of fear and awe, as though she wasn't sure whether to believe that someone could actually fight for her. I turned toward her briefly, gave her a nod, and whispered through my expression, "You matter. You always have." And something in her eyes softened, her back straightening for the first time since I'd met her. That was the moment I realized this fight was no longer just about winning a case. It was about reminding people who had been discarded by society that their lives weren't footnotes. They were entire stories worth telling. The judge cleared his throat, the smallest gesture, but in the silence of the courtroom it sounded like thunder. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the bench, his steely eyes fixed on me. "Counselor," he said, his voice deliberate, almost heavy with meaning, "your defense is unconventional." My stomach tightened. This was the moment every lawyer dreads, when the judge interrupts, when his words could either validate everything you've built or dismantle it in seconds. But I didn't flinch. Instead, I raised my chin, breathed deeply, and replied, "Your Honor, justice has never been conventional. If we reduce people to their mistakes without considering their circumstances, then justice isn't justice at all. It's cruelty dressed in procedure." The courtroom hushed even more, as though the very walls wanted to preserve my words. The judge blinked, and for the first time since I'd entered, a small crack appeared in his otherwise unreadable demeanor. It wasn't a smile, but it was something. Perhaps recognition, perhaps the faint acknowledgement of a truth even he couldn't deny. Meanwhile, my mother shifted in her seat again, her fingers fidgeting with the clasp of her designer purse. I could feel her unease from across the room. She had come here, perhaps, expecting to see me falter, to collect evidence for her endless narrative that I was an embarrassment to the Carter name. Instead, she was watching her daughter command a courtroom, earning not pity but respect. Her eyes rolled yet again, but this time it lacked conviction. My father's silence deepened, his gaze now fixed firmly on the floor, as though if he just refused to look up, he could pretend none of this was happening. I almost pitied him, not because he refused to acknowledge me, but because he was missing it, missing the chance to witness the transformation of the girl they had belittled into a woman who no longer needed their approval. I wasn't fighting for them anymore. Not for their nods. Not for their love. I was fighting for every person like my client, like me, who had ever been told they were less than, that they would never rise. The prosecutor stood, flustered, his voice higher pitched than it had been earlier. "Objection, Your Honor," he snapped. "The defense is attempting to use emotional appeals rather than sticking to the law." The judge lifted his hand, silencing him with a gesture that carried more weight than any words. "Overruled," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving me. Overruled. That single word felt like vindication, not just in this trial, but in the silent war I had been waging my entire life against voices that tried to dismiss me. The prosecutor sat down, his jaw tight, his confidence crumbling before the eyes of everyone present. And in that moment, I knew I had shifted the tides, not just of this case, but of my own narrative. The power in that room no longer belonged to the ones who had titles, status, or wealth. It belonged to the truth, and I was its vessel. I spoke for what felt like hours, weaving evidence with empathy, law with lived experience. Every sentence was a stone laid into the foundation of a case that couldn't be ignored. The jurors leaned closer with each word, some of them nodding, others frowning as if grappling with their own assumptions being shattered before their eyes. By the time I concluded, the silence in the courtroom was no longer heavy. It was electric, charged with the weight of possibility. I let the silence sit, refusing to fill it with nervous chatter, because silence, I had learned, could be just as powerful as words. When I finally returned to my seat, my client reached out, her hand trembling as she touched mine. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. And in that fragile word, I heard the echoes of my younger self thanking the woman I had become, The judge leaned back, his gavel resting loosely in his hand, and I could tell he was no longer just considering a verdict for my client. He was considering me. And though my parents sat behind me, rolling eyes and lowered heads, I didn't need them. Because in that room, in that silence, I knew I had found something more powerful than their approval. I had found my place. And no one could take it from me again. When the judge finally spoke again, the silence in the courtroom felt like the moment before a storm breaks, charged, breathless, heavy with anticipation. Every eye turned toward him, every ear strained to catch the weight of his words. He shifted in his seat, leaning forward with a kind of gravity that only comes after years of holding other people's futures in your hands. His gaze fell on me again, sharp but no longer just assessing. It was almost as if he were trying to reconcile the young woman he remembered from smaller hearings with the force standing before him now. He cleared his throat and said, "Counselor Carter, your argument has reminded this court that the law is not merely a structure of rules, but a pursuit of justice. This courtroom has seen many defenses, many attorneys, but rarely one that has pierced through the walls of procedure with such humanity." My chest tightened, every muscle in my body holding itself still as though the wrong movement might shatter this fragile moment. Then his voice dropped lower, firmer. "The charges against your client are dismissed. Case closed." The gavel struck, a sound that ricocheted across the room like a thunderclap. For a heartbeat, the room didn't move. My client gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as tears slipped down her cheeks. She turned to me, whispering "thank you" over and over, the words tumbling out like prayers answered. The jurors exchanged glances, some visibly moved, others still processing what they had just witnessed. The prosecutor slumped into his chair, the smugness that had defined him earlier now gone, replaced with the unmistakable weight of defeat. And in the midst of all of it, I sat straighter, not from arrogance but from the quiet, burning pride that comes when years of struggle finally break into triumph. My eyes flicked briefly to the gallery where my parents sat, and what I saw made something deep inside me ache. Not because of what it revealed about me, but because of what it revealed about them. My mother's eyes were wide, her usual mask of disdain cracked, though even now she tried to hold onto the brittle remnants of her composure. Her fingers tightened around her purse until her knuckles whitened. My father, though, finally lifted his gaze. For the first time in years, he looked at me, not at the ground, not past me, but directly into my eyes. And what I saw there wasn't pride, wasn't joy, but something almost harder to bear: regret. A regret so heavy it seemed to bend his shoulders even more than age already had I wanted, for a fleeting second, to let that matter, to let their recognition, however belated, mean something. But then the truth hit me like a tidal wave. I didn't need it. I had never truly needed it. My worth had never depended on whether my mother rolled her eyes or my father looked down. My worth had been carved in the long nights I studied while they doubted me, in the cases I took on when no one else would, in the voices I amplified when the world tried to silence them. My worth was standing in that courtroom, commanding respect from people who had no reason to give it except that I had earned it. And in that moment, I felt something deeper than validation. I felt freedom. Freedom from the endless cycle of seeking approval from people too broken to give it. Freedom from the chains of their neglect, their words, their dismissal. I was no longer the girl they tried to keep small. I was the woman who had made the room fall silent, who had turned even the judge's gaze, who had set a precedent not just in law but in life. As I walked out of the courtroom with my client by my side, the weight of years seemed to lift from my shoulders. Outside, the sun was brighter than it had been when I entered, and for the first time in a long time, I felt as though I was stepping into a world I had built for myself. My client hugged me tightly before she left, whispering, "You saved me," but I knew the truth. I hadn't just saved her. I had saved myself too. The girl I used to be, the one who cried herself to sleep in a home where love was rationed and approval was always withheld, had finally been laid to rest. In her place stood Emily Carter, attorney, advocate, survivor. And as people passed by, whispering about the case, about me, I realized something profound. Sometimes the silence of a room doesn't come from intimidation, it comes from recognition. From people witnessing a force they can't ignore. So, if you're listening to my story right now, I want to ask you, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, because I'd love to know how far this voice can reach. And tell me honestly, if you had to rate this story from 1 to 10, what would you give it? Because for me, this isn't just a story, it's proof. Proof that no matter how others define you, no matter how small they try to keep you, there comes a day when you define yourself. And when that day comes, the world doesn't just hear you, they fall silent to listen. Don't forget to subscribe to Outstanding Stories for more powerful journeys like this, because you never know, the next one might just change the way you see yourself, too.